Margaret was the most polite 12-year-old you would ever meet. She had white blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and the most beautiful smile you would ever see in your life. Margaret lived with her mother, two younger siblings, and her father, or who she thought was her father. Margaret was very close with her mother, Elaine. She was only 28 years old with three kids. Margaret's relationship with her father was different than the one with her mother. Her father's name was Noah, and he was 40 years old. He was very strict and very serious. It's a rare time if he ever smiled. Margaret was sometimes slightly afraid of him. Margaret had a younger sister named Violet, who was 8 years old. Violet was often nicknamed Vi. Violet was a relatively well-behaved child, even though she did act out sometimes. Violet was a daddy's girl, even though she was also slightly scared of her father. Margaret also had a younger brother named Kirk. He was only 3 years old. Kirk wasn't necessarily afraid of his father because he didn't realize serious looks in a person. Violet and Kirk nicknamed Margaret Maggie. Her mother did as well, but only when her father wasn't around. If I'm going to be honest, then I will say that Elaine was also afraid of Noah. He was much older than her and much more serious. Elaine was like a child in an adult's body, but whenever she tried to play with her children, Noah wouldn't have it. He always commanded Elaine to be like him, but she never did it. She only pretended to. Elaine was a different person when Noah wasn't around. One day, Margaret was sitting at a table doing her homework until her mother came in. "Take a break, darling," said Elaine. "Okay," said Margaret, putting her pen down. "Where's father?" she asked. "He's in the basement," answered Elaine. Margaret didn't say anything. She just stayed silent. "Maggie, what's wrong?" Elaine asked. "Well, it's—" Margaret didn't finish her sentence because her father walked in. "Who's Maggie?" he started saying. "Her name is Margaret. I want my daughter called by her real name," he commanded. Terrified of his presence, both Elaine and Margaret agreed. Noah left the house with his usual serious face. "Keep talking, darling," said Elaine. "It's the fact that I look completely like you, and that Violet and Kirk look like father, but they have your eyes," she said. Margaret wasn't finished there. "Father treats me differently to Violet and Kirk." "I don't know," said Elaine. "Maybe it's just the way he might treat them, and the way that he might treat you is when they're older." Margaret nodded and went to her room. Elaine was hiding a secret from her daughter. It caused her pain, and it kept her in a state of fear. She could never tell anyone. One day there was a knock on the door. Elaine answered it, and who she saw was someone she'd never forgotten. A man was at the door, in his 20s or 30s, blue eyes and red hair. Margaret heard the man at the door, but she didn't come out of her room. She was afraid of her father. Suddenly, the talking turned into shouting, and what sounded like arguments, like really aggressive arguments. Then suddenly, everything went completely silent, as if somebody had just pressed pause. That pause scared Margaret. She plucked up the courage to go downstairs and ask what was going on. Her father was standing by the basement, as if nothing happened. "What's going on?" Margaret asked. "Nothing, Margaret," he said. "Where's mother?" said Margaret. "She went out," Noah said, vaguely. "And where's Violet and Kirk?" she asked again. "They went with her," said Noah, trying to avoid the conversation. Margaret wasn't sure what to think, but she knew that arguing with her father wasn't even an option. 9 hours later, and still no sign of Elaine, Violet, or Kirk. Margaret was suspicious. Suddenly there was screaming and what sounded like fighting and banging. Margaret wouldn't let her fears stop her. She ran out of her room and dashed downstairs, all the noises coming from the basement. Margaret opened the door and dashed down the basement stairs. What she saw was something she was never, ever, ever prepared for. Margaret saw her father and the man who was at the door, fighting, both knives in their hands and both covered in blood. She saw her mother. She saw her mother, dead, with Violet and Kirk's dead bodies in a corner that were all covered in blood. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized her mother and siblings were dead. She knew that one of the men killed them. Next to her foot, Margaret saw a pistol. She picked it up and realized that it was loaded. With every bit of courage that her body could take, She picked up the gun and drew it at the two men. "Drop the knives!" Margaret shouted. She was able to get the men's attention as they followed her order. Both men raised their hands and stood completely still. Margaret had tears running down her cheeks as she wasn't sure who to shoot. "Ruby, it's me. Shoot him," shouted the man. "Who's Ruby?" thought Margaret. "Margaret, shoot him. He killed your mother and your sister and your brother," shouted Noah. Both men started panicking and shouting at Margaret to shoot the other. Margaret had a choice to shoot her father or a man that she doesn't even know. In the end, Margaret ended up shooting the man. The guilt automatically hit her in the face. She looked over at her mother's dead body and vomited because of the smell. She broke down in tears and fell to her knees, and her hands were in contact with the vomit. Noah walked over to Margaret and comforted her, which was a bit of a surprise to Margaret because he's never acted like this before. Noah picked her up and carried her to her room. Margaret felt sick and she could still smell the dead bodies, and her hands were still smothered in vomit. After vomiting for 10 minutes, Margaret cried out for hours non-stop. After all those hours, Margaret got up and washed her hands in the bathroom. Her feelings about her mother in particular were far more complicated. Margaret vomited again, just thinking about it. But she knew that she had to be brave. She went back into her room and prayed by her bed. That night, Margaret woke up and had a sickly feeling that something was wrong. As she tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, her father opened the door with both hands behind his back and just stood there. It scared Margaret. Margaret didn't say anything. He walked over and sat on his bed and smirked. "You know I love you, Margaret," Noah said with an evil look in his eyes. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't even try to look afraid. "But I mightn't have been completely honest with you," he started saying. This is what Noah was explaining to Margaret. When Elaine was 15, she met this boy named Caleb, who was 16. They were completely in love with each other. It wasn't long after that Elaine felt pregnant. When Elaine was 16, she gave birth to a baby girl they named Ruby. Caleb at the time was 17. 1 year later, Caleb was at college, while Elaine stayed at home to look after Ruby. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Elaine opened it, and she came face to face with a man with a gun. He grabbed Elaine and held her hostage. Then he grabbed her again and slammed her into his car. Once he locked the door, he went back into the house and grabbed Ruby. He went back to the car and tried to drive them away. But as he started the car, Caleb arrived home and saw his girls in the back of a stranger's car. He leapt out of his car and tried to get the girls out. The man with the gun got out of the car and started fighting Caleb. After fighting for half an hour, Caleb was bleeding and covered in bruises. The man threatened Caleb that if he ever saw Elaine or Ruby again, he would kill them. The man introduced himself as Noah. He took the two girls to his house and forced Elaine to change the name of her daughter, Ruby, to Margaret. Kirk and Violet were Noah and Elaine's children. Noah forced Elaine to have children with him. After 11 years of searching, Caleb finally found his partner and daughter, but Noah stuck to his threat. And Margaret made a big mistake, but it isn't her fault. She didn't know. Things are making sense now to Margaret. That's why the man called her Ruby. Caleb knew she was his daughter. Once that was said, Ruby, what we'll call her now, was petrified. Noah put his hands on her cheek and said, "Margaret, we haven't spent enough time together. But now, we'll be together forever." Ruby never heard the gunshot that killed her. As Noah stood up, he let out a sick, maniacal laugh.